Okay, so we are recording. It's my pleasure to welcome our guest speaker, Dave Jackson. Dave is a frequent participant as a presenter on the Forest Connect webinar series. I like to get Dave at least once a year, if not more. He always has a great presentation, very thorough and informed and detailed, and a great interaction and dynamic with the audience. And tonight Dave joins us from Penn State University Cooperative Extension. He's my go-to guy when I have an herbicide invasive plant question, and he's speaking tonight about the identification and control of invasive plants on Forestland. We had an awesome session at noon, and I'm sure the same thing this evening. So welcome to the audience and welcome, Dave. Thank you. I'm going to mute my microphone and enjoy another session.
Okay, thanks a lot, Pete, and welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started here. So we're going to hold questions till the end, but if you think of questions as we go along so that you don't forget them, be sure to type them in the chat pod and we'll get to them in the order that they were received at the end. Thanks. So with that, let's get going here. So let's start with some background information, and then what we're going to do is move into control, and then ultimately we're going to follow it up with a summary of a number of different species that kind of give us some background, identification, and control. So let's start with our definition here. So what are invasive plants? These are plants which grow rapidly, spread aggressively, and displace other native plants. And an executive order define invasive plant as a species that is non-native or alien to the ecosystem under consideration. So oftentimes we use that term invasive even to represent native plants, but really by definition, an invasive plant is not native to the ecosystem that you're looking at. And then the second part of that definition of invasive is that it causes or is likely to cause economic or environmental harm or harm to human health. And really, most of the plants that we're going to talk about tonight are causing environmental harm, although some we could probably say are causing economic harm with the loss of forest regeneration and things of that nature. We also refer to them as exotic or noxious. A lot of states like Pennsylvania have noxious weed laws, which prohibits the sale of plants that are listed or propagation of plants that are listed as noxious weeds. And they come in all shapes and sizes, so trees, shrubs, vines, grasses, and forbs. So we're going to go through some characteristics on invasive plants, things that are common to almost all of them, but some a little bit different. Some don't follow all of these rules, but in general, these are the characteristics of invasive. So certainly difficult to control, fewer if any native controls. So these plants were introduced from a different country, and they don't have their native insects, their diseases, their herbivores, or even other plant competitors that kept them in check. So they're allowed to just spread and be very prolific in how they can reproduce. Which is the next point here, where they have rapid early growth rates, mature quickly, and produce large numbers of seed and sprout or resprout easily. So that's one of the problems with our plants, certainly, is when they're cut, most of them will sprout very vigorously from the cut stumps. And then the last part of this here is that they spread aggressively by roots, seeds, and shoots, and they disperse away from the parent plant. So birds typically are eating the seeds, but also mammals, wind disperse some of them, even water, and certainly us moving them around on our equipment, our clothing, our shoes even. So certainly a problem there with us dispersing the seed. Seeds remain viable for years, so some we can have seed bank for as many as 5 to 7 years once the seed is stored in the soil. They spread to disturbed sites, so log sites, rights of ways, roadsides, mine sites, abandoned cropland, old home sites certainly are areas that we're going to commonly find invasive plants. So definitely very disturbance oriented. They have wide site tolerances from shade, drought, flooded sites, poor soils, And a lot of our invasive shrubs leaf out earlier in the springtime and shed their leaves later in the fall compared to our native plants, giving them an extended growing season advantage. And then last one here typically applies only to the tree of heaven, but it is allelopathic, which means that it has chemicals that it releases that can suppress other plants. So here's an interesting distribution map that shows the nationwide invasion by invasive plants. And this is looking at the U.S. Forest Service data from 2016, looking at forest inventory and analysis plots and looking for the presence of at least one invasive plant on those plots. And basically what it's showing you is the invasion potential or percentage, and you can see it across the different regions of the United States. So very low in the Intermountain region there, the Rocky Mountains, only 6%. But if you look at the Northeast and the Lake states, you're as high as 52%. And the different colors represent the invasion potential or invasion percentage, and the redder and the orangish color plots are the higher invasion percentages, up to even 100% invaded where the red is located. And then that goes down to the green area. So you see, particularly in Pennsylvania and New York, our big woods areas are very green, but then you move into the more populated areas, the more fragmented wood lots, the more disturbance that you have, the more people that you tend to have, you see a much higher invasion potential. Pennsylvania's woods are 62% invaded based on this data. I did want to point out the line here. So here's the line we were talking about, Pete, between New York State and Pennsylvania. So something a little funky going on with the data there, but I still think overall it's a pretty good reflection of the presence or absence of invasive plants. And then this gives you an idea of the numbers of plants that we're talking about. More than 1,500 invasive plants are recognized or reported across the United States, and over 100 invasive terrestrial plants just in Pennsylvania, as reported by the Pennsylvania DCNR, and that's 2019 data there. So this is the slide where I kind of talk about why do we care. So why do we care about invasive plants? Why do we care about controlling invasive plants, things of that nature? So they do degrade native environments. They displace native plant communities and decrease native plant species diversity. So these plants will take over areas and they'll crowd out native plants, reducing that biodiversity in those areas. They can inhibit forest regeneration, so make it very difficult for us to regenerate or replace forests following a harvest or even just a natural disturbance where tree mortality occurs. They can slow or halt natural succession. We've seen some old field sites that instead of going through the natural successional stages, when they get to that invasive shrub community taking over those sites, we see succession halted. We don't see those areas reverting to a forest eventually. They degrade wildlife habitats, so they're poor food producers. We see very few of our invasive plants browsed on by deer, for example. And if we do see them browse, it's typically that is a last resort. It's because the other plants in those areas have been completely browsed out. The seeds and berries on things like autumn olive or shrub honeysuckle are very high in carbohydrates, but they're very low in proteins and lipids and fats, which is really what our birds need for migrations or even to survive cold winter nights. And so we don't see them being as nutritious for our wildlife. And then the last point here is about insects. Non-native plants in general host very few insects. So these plants just don't have the native insects that they would normally occupy them. And this has a direct impact on the food web. And this is something that Doug Tallamy studied extensively. Dr. Tallamy is an entomology professor at the University of Delaware. And he published a book here, you see, Bringing Nature Home. They also did some video work called Hometown Habitats. And this was all about how you can sustain wildlife with native plants. So one of the things that he studied extensively was the numbers of insects hosted on native plant species versus introduced or non-native plants, and particularly looking at some of the invasives. So this was one of his quotes here: all we need to do is plant native plants, and I add to that, and control the invasives. So looking at landscapes, particularly in developed areas, one of the things we always touted in the horticulture industry was this plant, has no insects or diseases that affect it. But that's really a problem when you're trying to support the food web. We really need those native plants. We need those insects that are hosted by those plants. Here's some of the data that he produced from some of his studies. So these are all native plants listed here. And this is the number of butterfly and moth species that are supported by these plants. And here's oak, the very first bar. It's over 500 different species of butterflies and moth. And even if we move all the way out to the end of the spectrum, here's American beech and walnut here, we're still up over 100 different species just looking at butterflies and moth larvae in particular that would feed on these particular tree species. And so why is that important? Oak, well, here's another quote from oak trees support more wildlife than any other plant. But here's why it's important, is that 96% of all terrestrial birds rear their young on insects. So if we don't have these native plants in our landscapes and in our woods, if they're all completely crowded out and being replaced by non-native invasive plants, we're not raising these birds. We're not starting that food chain. One of the things he studied was how many larvae it would take just to raise one clutch of chickadees, and some of the data that he supported is very surprising to me, but it was between 5,000 and 9,000 caterpillars just to raise one clutch of chickadees. And so if that chickadee is not finding those larvae or having to travel great distance because those larvae just aren't available in that habitat anymore, they're going to have, number one, either the parents are going to be predated or the young just aren't going to be able to fledge the nest. And then here's another point that I wanted to make in regards to deer and invasive plants. So deer do not prefer to browse on a lot of these invasive plants. Deer reduce native plant richness, so the numbers of different kinds of native plants, and they also reduce the abundance of those plants, but not invasive plants. And here's a quote that I would share with you from Bern Blassie from Cornell University and David Gorchow from Miami University. They say that invasive plant species removal without deer reduction is certain to fail in most instances or result in only minor improvements. And so when we begin to implement control measurements, we really have to consider what the impact of the white-tailed deer is going to be on those efforts. So let's talk about control a little bit, and we're going to use what we call an integrated approach. And so we're going to look at each of these control measures for our invasive plant control, and we want to try to use as many of these measures as we can. So cultural, mechanical, biological, and chemical. So cultural control, I call that indirect weed management. We're going to try to enhance the growth of desirable plants by using proper forest management practices, by reducing the impact that the deer are having by harvesting an appropriate number of female or antlerless deer. We're going to prevent the spread of undesirable plants by eliminating seed sources, by planting natives, by reducing the seed spread, by cleaning our equipment, by stopping soil movement. And we really have to consider what seeds are on our tractors when we're moving from different sites to site, what seed might be in the soil that's on the skidder that's moving onto your property. Are you taking seed? For example, one of the things that I'm really nervous about doing is introducing Japanese stiltgrass to my brother's property in western New York in Steuben County. I don't want to bring it up there on my vehicle. I don't want to bring it up there on soil that might even be in my boots, for example. So those are things that we really have to keep in mind from a cultural control perspective. And then the last one is minimizing disturbance. So understanding that these plants are very disturbance oriented. There are times when the recommendation is hold on, let's not open that canopy up. We've got to get these invasive plants under control before we do anything. And then understanding that when you do management work, when you do logging operations and you do road building operations, things like that, that you are opening that window, you're opening that opportunity for these plants to move into those sites. And now you've got to be vigilant to keep them under control. So the next one is mechanical control, and this is things like hand removal, including pulling or cutting, mowing, things like that, using weed wrenches, or the latest now is called the puller bear. But what's the issue with this whenever you're doing any kind of cutting or mowing of these plants is they're typically just going to resprout on you. So you need to understand that this is oftentimes used to provide access into areas, but without follow-up herbicide treatments, cutting is going to be likely very ineffective at actually getting rid of the plants. So biological control, these are natural pest controls, insects and diseases. So do we have any things, or even grazing by livestock? We do have a couple of diseases that do infect our invasive plants, like the Ailanthus wilt on tree of heaven, or rose rosette disease on multiflora rose. So the Ailanthus wilt is a verticillium disease, a fungal disease that infects tree of heaven. It was first discovered here in Pennsylvania, and it's currently being looked at to see if we can get it labeled as a biocontrol agent. So a number of other studies that are taking place right now, particularly to make sure that if we move this fungus around, that it is not going to impact other desirable plants or agricultural crops, things of that nature. And then rose rosette disease is a viral disease that is spread by a mite. I've seen it completely kill multiflora roses. I've never seen it actually eradicate the plant from an area. It seems like every time you find one dead from the disease, there's 5 more popping up somewhere else. But it's still some good news for us to have a bit of biological control on that plant. And then a lot of folks think the goats are the answer. It's from a biological control method. It's a neat opportunity, but I found that, number one, it's very expensive to move goats into an area, to fence areas, but they're not real selective grazers. They're going to eat both your native and your non-native plants. And when you move the goats out of those areas, those plants are going to be responding, and they're going to grow back. So again, just keep that in mind. Without some kind of follow-up, it's not likely to be real successful just having goats grazing in those areas where you have invasive plants. It might provide you some opportunities to get in there to reduce the infestation, certainly reduce the size of the plants, though, and make it a little bit more manageable. So that often brings us to chemical control, or the use of herbicides. And I state a number of things here that they're productive. Certainly with limited budgets, manpower, and time, they're going to be your most productive approach, effective. This is a picture here of Art Gover. He's one of my colleagues here at Penn State. He spent most of his career applying herbicides on various plants. We know how to do this. We know the rates, we know the products, we know the time of year, so we know how to be effective at controlling these plants. We have some selective application methods that we can apply herbicide, so it's only going directly into that stem or into that plant that we're trying to control. And we also have some selective chemistry, so we have some herbicides that will only control grasses, some that will only control broadleaves, some that only work on seed that are trying to germinate. So we can be very selective in our approach sometimes to control these invasive plants. And then lastly, I say necessary, because oftentimes when we look at each plant and go back through that integrated approach, we often land here on the herbicide approach because we just don't have an effective means otherwise. So how are herbicides applied? There's a number of different application methods. Some are very selective, some not as much. So foliar spot applications can be selective, where you're treating just that individual plant. This is versus broadcast types of treatments using machinery or mist blower, maybe, for example. Those are not very selective treatments. Basal bark treatments can be very selective, where the herbicide is applied directly to that stem from the ground line up to a height of about 1 foot or 18 inches completely around the stem. Or axe frill, hack and squirt, again, another very selective approach where the herbicide is being applied directly to cuts in the stem. We leave spaces between our cuts like you see in this image so that you get good movement, good movement of the herbicide down to the roots. And then the last one there is stump treatment. So if the plant has to be removed, you can cut the plant and treat the stump so that it doesn't resprout. So that can be effective means to control resprouting on a lot of our invasive shrubs, for example. So what do you need to get started? Virtually all the work we're going to talk about here, and we do a highlight on the individual plants, can be done with a backpack sprayer. I would recommend buying the shoulder saver harness to go with it. Hatchet in a spray bottle if you're going to be doing any kind of hack and squirt work. The personal protective and clothing, rubber boots, long sleeve shirt, rubber gloves, eye protection is going to be all that you're going to need to wear when you're out there doing the work. I would suggest that you invest in a number of different size apertures for adjustable cone spray tips, maybe a check valve that you put right at the end of your wand so that it shuts the tip off directly right there at the end of the wand so that you don't have any drippage when you're moving from plant to plant. But that's about all you're going to need to get started. So what do you use? I recommend basically just 3 active ingredients. There might be a few individual situations where you might need something else, but overall, these 3 active ingredients are going to be able to take care of virtually every plant situation that you're going to encounter, except for real specific cases. So glyphosate, the active ingredient, things like Rodeo or Accord XRT2. Triclopyr comes in an amine and an ester formulation. So the water-based amine would be something like Bassland. The ester formulation, or the oil-based formulation that goes in oil for basal bark applications, would be Garland 4 Ultra as an example. Sulfalmetron methyl, this is typically product of choice would be Oust XP, but there are generics of all of these that are now available on the market. But sulfalmetron methyl is a grass and a broadleaf herbicide. It also has soil and pre-emergence activity. So it is selective to hardwood trees and conifers, so you can spray it right over top of those plants without harming them. And you can control the grasses, you can control seed germination, things like that with sulfalmetron methyl. Caveat being, I say that these things need to be labeled for use in your state, so you need to check what your state regulations are, and they need to be labeled for use on the site. So every product has a list of labeled sites on it. You need to make sure that you're using it in labeled sites. For example, there's a lot of glyphosate products out there that do not have forest labels on them. So if you're applying it in the forest, you need to make sure that the label is listed accordingly. And then lastly, I say non-restricted use. We really don't have to use anything that's restricted use. At least the way our regulations are set up here in Pennsylvania, all of these products can be purchased by private forest landowners and applied to their own property without any kind of certification requirement. And I know that's not the case in some of our states, so be sure to check your local state regulations. So we're going to move into our invasive plant summaries, and we're going to quickly go through a number of examples here. Japanese stiltgrass, which is an annual grass, mile-a-minute vine, an annual vine. Oriental bittersweet, a perennial vine. Japanese knotweed, a perennial forb. We're going to look at a number of shrubs, barberry, honeysuckle, and olive. And then the last summary that we're going to do is tree of heaven. So we're going to use this as kind of a starting point whenever you're dealing with, some kind of plant that might be very similar to one of these as far as the control recommendations are concerned, because they're pretty much going to be the same. So Japanese stiltgrass, so this is an annual summer grass, grows to 4 feet tall. It forms that thick thatch. I'll show you some images here. This is where it gets its name. These are stilt roots, so when you pull that plant out, you can look for those stilt roots. Another way to identify it is this silver midrib on it that's just slightly off center. This again is an annual grass, so it's germinating in the springtime and maturing and going to seed in late summer, early fall. So it grows in a wide variety of sites, but it is shade tolerant. We see it move along our roadsides like this from vehicle traffic, where it hits a culvert maybe. It'll move right out into the woods with the water. Skid roads, things like that, equipment, very bare ground adapted, it'll move it right into the forest. So mechanical control would be things like hand pulling or mowing. Keep in mind this is a late summer, early fall cedar, so we want to try to do any kind of control measures before seed is set, and so keep that in mind. Pulling or mowing would be very difficult on most infestations. There's no biological control on this plant that I'm aware of. A site like this, it would not be practical to mow it or try to even consider pulling it out of the ground. So typically we're looking at chemical control measures, and I have found really that you need to use something that has some kind of soil activity that's going to work on seed germination. If you just use a non-selective approach like a glyphosate type herbicide, you'll kill the existing grass, but you'll do nothing for the seed that's stored in that soil, and it may even regerminate and go to seed again that same season if you applied it earlier enough. So I have found using something like the sulfamethyl and methyl is going to be the best approach. There are some other products that work specifically, if you want a more selective approach, that work specifically on seed germination in the soil, so they have just pre-emergence activity. Sulfamethyl and methyl has both. It'll kill the existing grass, but it'll also work on seed that's trying to germinate in the soil. So for each plant, we're going to present these little treatment calendars here. So you can see the early season treatments, pre-emergence, March, April, May. This can be done still right on throughout. It will control the grass even right on through as long as it's green and growing. It's a very effective product on Japanese stiltgrass. It'll buy you a couple of years, but we don't have anything that's going to have real long-term effects on Japanese stiltgrass, and it is very related to the impact of the white-tailed deer. If you can get native plants established, you're going to be able to have some success with that kind of treatment. But if the deer are still browsing everything out, it's likely that the stiltgrass is going to be back in a few years. Mile a minute vine. This is another annual. So this is a climbing thorny vine. You can see the thorns on the stem, this triangular shaped leaf. This circular structure on the leaf stem is another real key characteristic of this plant. Here's the fruit. So as it ripens, it's going to turn this purplish blue color. So very distinctive. Don't confuse it with any of our native terethums. These thorns along here on the stems, these curved barbs are very distinctive and much stouter than our native terethum plants. So this plant does need full sunlight to grow, and it readily colonizes following disturbance. The birds are spreading the seeds, and this is a noxious weed in Pennsylvania. It was first found here in Pennsylvania, but it has since spread pretty far and wide already from that original infestation. Keys to control, again, on this one being an annual, is to prevent it from going to seed. Treat the plants when they're small, treat them early in the season, and be persistent. The seed remains viable in the soil for at least 5 years. It does pull very easily. You will need a heavy pair of gloves, and I would recommend a long sleeve shirt because it will scratch you up pretty good. If the plants have gone to seed, I would recommend bagging those seeds and moving them off site. Although in the process of pulling, you're going to knock a lot of seeds off onto the ground. This is a really effective method. I do a lot of pulling on an infestation that I have on a demonstration woodlot that I manage. And it can be pretty effective at minimizing the spread of this plant. It's not a means to eradication, certainly, but you'd be surprised when you start pulling how much is just one plant and how easy you can just pull it out of the ground. There is a weevil that has been introduced, but I have not seen that to be very effective. It was introduced here in my county where I live here along Interstate 80, and honestly, that infestation just seems to be spreading every year. So I'm not sure of the effectiveness. Where I've seen it, it hasn't been very effective. I don't think it was ever designed to eradicate this plant, but just to slow it down a bit, but I'm not sure it's very effective, to be honest with you. So again, we're at chemical control here. So pre-emergent herbicides are going to be very effective, like sulfametron methyl applied in late February to early April. Post-emergent treatments do work well on this plant as well. Glyphosate or triclopyr. The idea would be earlier in the season is better. Problem with those kind of treatments is if it's growing up on any kind of desirable plants, chances are you're going to be killing those as well. So it depends on the severity of the infestation, whether you do post-emergence treatments and how many desirable plants you have present in those areas. With a pre-emergent treatment, you can be pretty selective, leaving a lot of the woody vegetation. Even blackberry briars and things like that are just going to get dinged up a little bit, but typically they will recover. So here's the treatment window on the calendar here. So early season pre-emergent treatments with sulfametron methyl, later season treatments, which we call post-emergent treatments, and early on in the summertime are effective, but once you get later in the season, you're going to have seed set already. And so, you're going to be battling that seed source that's already going to be present on that site. Targeted pulling, so once you get those plants up to size enough where you're recognizing them and you can see them and they're getting up on vegetation where you can pull it, pulling is probably one of the best and most effective methods for small infestations. So Oriental Bittersweet, this is a perennial climbing woody vine, so it's deciduous. 60 feet tall, 6 inches in diameter, no problem. It can climb up the largest trees in your woodlot without any trouble because it's a twining vine. So it'll twine or climb and circle around even grapevines or other trees in your woods. It'll strangle itself even. It'll twine so much. It is alternately leaved with these finely toothed leaves here. The new growth does look a little bit different than the older growth, where the new growth leaves are more elliptical, more pointed, and the older leaves seem to be more rounded. So make sure that you recognize that. And certainly the fruit is very recognizable on this. It does have separate male and female vines. So you're only going to find fruit on the female vines, which would be the ones that you want to target initially first to keep them from spreading. We do have an American bittersweet, so you may find American bittersweet out there. Learn to recognize the difference, and the only ones you're going to tell the difference on are the female vines. They also have separate male and female vines. The fruit on the female vines of the American bittersweet is only going to form at the ends of the twigs, versus on the Oriental bittersweet, you'll have fruit forming at every single node where there is a leaf. So much more prolific. Remember, that was one of the characteristics of an invasive plant, where they're producing way more seeds. So these do prefer open, sunny sites. You'll see them on the edges of fields, roadsides, along railroad rights-of-ways. It does tolerate some shade. I've seen some germinating, in the woods, but they don't seem to grow very rapidly like they do where they're getting sunlight. The wildlife certainly eat and spread the seeds. This is a root suckering plant, so you need to understand when this plant is cut or as it's growing, you're going to find multiple suckers coming off the same root system. And also people use it for arts and crafts projects like you see with this wreath, and have helped spread the plant. When they're done with that wreath, a lot of times they just get thrown out back in the woods and they start new infestations that way. This is probably one of the most difficult plants that you will deal with. Certainly by far the one that I have the most trouble with. I'm actually finding more of this now than ever, and it seems to be even more numerous and more prolific than a lot of the invasive shrubs that you're contending with as well. So small vines can be pulled, but remember, These are root suckering species. A lot of times you're going to pull it and you're going to find that it's attached to a much larger vine. Mowing it promotes root suckering. I have a field here that is near the University Park Airport that Penn State owns, and they maintain it by mowing, and it has Oriental Bittersweet in it, and literally that field is just absolutely covered now with Oriental Bittersweet. So I don't know of any biological means to control this plant. Oh, and the cut vines do resprout from stumps and roots. So if you cut it, recognize that you're forcing that plant to resprout. So it's going to sprout from the stump, and it's going to sprout from the root system as well. And the seeds remain viable in the soil for years. So again, this is a root sprouting species. So we're going to look at only using late season herbicide applications so that we get the most translocation of that herbicide down to control the root system. Typically, I recommend a two-step approach. So we're going to remove the aerial portion first. We can do that any time of year. I usually tell people to do what I call a window cut. That means we cut it at the ground line, and then we cut it again at eye level. This way we can look across the area that we're working on, and we can see, okay, we've already got those vines cut. If you cut them at the ground line only, you're going to look over there and you're going to not be able to tell whether they were cut or not. So we use what we call a window cut. You can treat the stumps at the time of cutting. It's kind of a judgment call. If you've got lots of little tiny stems, treating those stumps is not going to be practical. But if you've got a handful of really large stems, it's going to help you at least slow down or eliminate some of the resprouting that's going to occur. But realize once you cut it, you're forcing that plant to resprout, and then the idea being that you're going to come back and treat that foliage regrowth late season. So let's say we cut it in the wintertime or early spring. By the end of that growing season, we're going to come back to that same site and retreat all of the sprouts. And so if you're cutting it in the summertime, then you're likely going to come back the following season and do the treatment. But you've got to give it enough time to regrow that you've got enough foliage there to get good translocation and good coverage to bring enough herbicide down to control the root system. And again, all these treatments are late summer, so no earlier than July are we putting herbicide on this plant. So we can use, besides foliage treatments, we can use hack and squirt treatments. We can treat the cut stumps, as I mentioned, and we can also do basal bark treatments if the vine are separated from the trees that so we don't get herbicide onto the tree that we're trying to keep. So here's the timing of that. Notice all of these treatments: basal bark, foliar, stump treatments, hack and squirt, all start July and go right on through the late season as long as that plant is actively growing. Basal bark, we'll have a bit longer window because we can put them on stems when we don't have green foliage. And then window cutting, that can be done year round, but typically I recommend cutting these vines in the winter or early spring so that I can come back the end of that summer and actually treat the resprouts. Japanese knotweed, similar in a way that all the herbicide applications on Japanese knotweed are also going to be late season treatments. So this is a perennial herbaceous plant, so it comes back from the root systems each year. It has those hollow stems that resemble bamboo. You can see the greenish white flowers there. It grows 6 to 10 feet plus. I was in a stand just a couple of weeks ago that was well over 10 feet high. I would say it was probably more like 12 to 15 feet high. Grows very dense stands, eliminates all native vegetation, tends to spread along our river corridors very aggressively here in Pennsylvania and other areas. I've seen it all the way up into Ontario, Canada, and all over the Adirondacks. It grows on almost any kind of site, though. Acid mine sites here in Pennsylvania in full sunlight to shaded alluvial, real productive soils along rivers and streams underneath a tree canopy. But it spreads by a root system called a rhizome, and it can just spread out into areas with that rhizome. And by cutting it, you're forcing it to spread through those rhizomes. So mechanical control or cutting is not a useful standalone approach. This is a field that was mowed annually, and you can see how it just caused the knotweed to spread Contaminated soil is a source of rhizome fragments. So I've seen highway departments move it. I've seen farm equipment move it to new fields, things like that. So you really have to be careful not to move soil. I don't know of any biological means, but the key to controlling this plant is a two-step approach. So what we're going to talk about here is cutting it to the ground in early June. This is what you see in this image here, waiting 2 months or eight weeks, and then coming back and doing a foliar application in late summer, August 1st to September 1st. Or you can use multiple chemical treatments, but the only way that you're going to be able to do that is if you had a high volume sprayer, because you're going to be spraying plants that are well over your head, 10 to 15 feet high. When you cut the plant initially, this is what it looks like when you come back to retreat it. So you can see back here, these plants were not cut. These ones were, and when they regrow, now they're waist high. You can come back and spray them. And yes, this guy does not have his proper personal protective equipment on. He should have a long sleeve shirt on. So I wanted to point that out. So this is respraying 8 weeks after it was cut. This is what it looks like 12 months later after you've sprayed it. You will still have some residuals that will begin to resprout. And if you just walked away from this site, it would very readily take that site over again. So you need to be back. It's really important to follow up, 1, 2, 3 years even following that initial cutting and spraying, and be spot treating those new sprouts that are coming back up. So here's the treatment calendar. We're cutting this thing typically in June, and then we're coming back. And cutting can be done with a weed eater with a saw blade on it. You can cut it very easily if you have the high-powered weed eaters that you've got the nice shoulder harness on. Or if you can mow a site, you can just cut it down. I've even had people just whack it down with canoe paddles, and actually that's effective at causing it to resprout, because really the idea being there is you're really depleting that root system as much as possible. It's used all those root reserves up to grow initially. You cut it back, and now it hasn't really replenished anything, and it's got to regrow again. And in that 8-week time frame, it's just not going to grow very tall, allowing you to make these foliar herbicide applications no earlier than July, but the post-cutting treatments are typically going to be in August or early September. So moving into some of our shrubs here. So here's Japanese barberry. So this is a spiny, deciduous shrub. It has these very sharp spines on it. You can see them just in this image here. These little round or almost oval-shaped leaves on them, very small leaves. The yellow flowers that you see here, and the oblong red berries that'll persist through winter. Has very beautiful fall colors. You can see how invaded this woodlot is, but look at the fall colors that they have. This is a plant that is very touted in the landscape industry for the red berries and the beautiful fall coloration. A lot of times you'll see them with purple flowers or leaves. I mean, even in the summertime, different varieties of this plant are used. But this one will live and spread in full shaded areas, so it does not need disturbance in order to invade the woods. All different types of soil types, from ridge tops to wetlands. The seeds are distributed by birds. I've harvested grouse that have had their crop just full of Japanese barberry seeds. And when the branches arch over and touch back onto the ground, they can actually root and cause a larger infestation. So mechanical control on this plant is really not practical, and if you do cut it, it does resprout. Digging or pulling this plant out is not easy to do because the spines are even on those stems down low to the ground, and it does root pretty deeply. No biological control. Typically, when we're talking about chemical control, we're talking about either doing foliar applications, or I've had great success with basal bark applications using the ester formulation of triclopyr, which is what you see in this image right here. I actually treated this plant very early in the springtime when it was just leafing out, and you can see the oak seedlings here that were growing underneath it, that I was able to be that selective in my treatment to eliminate the barberry without getting spray on those oak seedlings. These oaks did not even have their leaves on them when I was treating that plant. So shrub honeysuckles are a number of different species of shrub honeysuckles. They're all invasive. There are some native honeysuckles. The best way to tell the difference, all the invasive ones have these hollow stems. So if you break a twig off there, break a branch off, and you see that hollow stem, it's likely that that is one of our invasive species. I show a couple different of the most common ones here in these images. So Morrow's honeysuckle and Moor honeysuckle. They all have opposite leaves and branching pattern to them. The leaves are typically oval in shape, except the Amur has more of a pointed stem versus the Morrows here. These pink, paired pink or creamy white flowers, and then the orange or red fruits, which I show you in these images. So these plants are intolerant of shade, so you're going to find them along the forest edge, open woodlands, abandoned fields and pastures, and along roadsides and open areas and upland habitats. They will move into disturbed woods, and again, the birds are transporting these seeds. So mechanical removal, hand removal of small plants is very effective on this. This plant does not root very deeply, and it can be very easy to pull out of the ground. If you're cutting it, though, it's going to resprout vigorously. So cutting alone it without some type of stump treatment is not going to be effective at controlling this plant. No biological control means, so that brings us to chemical control. So typically on this plant, we're doing foliar treatments or stump treatments if we want to remove the entire plant. Glyphosate can be used as a water-based material. This plant is very, very susceptible to glyphosate treatments, unlike the next one I'm going to show you here. The autumn olive is almost immune to glyphosate. But honeysuckles are, if you have honeysuckle in the area, glyphosate treatments can be very effective. You can also do basal bark treatments on this with the triclopyr ester formulation like Garland 4 Ultra. But I have found that large honeysuckle stems are relatively resistant to that active ingredient. I don't know if it's the shreddy bark that they have on their stems. You can control small ones real easy with basal bark treatments, but the larger stems seem to be somewhat resistant. So you need to either apply it higher on the stem, so a longer stretch on the stem. Instead of maybe doing a foot, maybe you're doing 2 feet on the stem, and you're using a higher concentration, maybe as high as 20% active ingredient. So autumn olive is just the opposite as far as control goes, because this plant is very susceptible to triclopyr, unlike the shrub honeysuckle. So the way to distinguish autumn olive is that silvery underside to the leaf. It grows to about 20 feet in height. It does have spiny branches on it, so look for those spines and be careful if you're cutting it and you're trying to remove it that way. It also has these small light yellow flowers, which I'll show you on the next slide here, and these red roundish fruits that have these, they're dotted with these little scales. So that's another real characteristic to identify the plant. So here's the flower of it right here. You can see how it invades old pastures and was planted actually heavily on a lot of strip mine sites, because it is a drought-tolerant plant. It's also a nitrogen fixer, so it thrives on poor soils, prefers full sunlight. The seeds are dispersed by birds and other animals as well that eat the seeds. Mechanical control, burning, cutting, or girdling will not control this plant. This is a vigorous resprouting plant, so cutting alone is not effective. Cutting will reduce seed production. Hand pulling, again, is very difficult, except on very small seedlings. This is a deeply rooted plant, and pulling it will be very difficult. No biological control. If we're going to use chemicals, we're going to look at 3 application methods. We're going to either treat stumps if we want to cut the plants and remove them, or we're going to do basal bark applications or foliar applications. And so here's the management calendar, and this would apply to all shrubs. So if you're dealing with barberry, honeysuckle, olive, multiflora, rose, privet, burning bush, even even any of the other shrubs that you might encounter out there, this would be the standard recommendation. So foliar herbicide applications using a combination of glyphosate and triclopyr. That's going to give you that broader spectrum of control. So examples would be using a Cord XRT2, which is a surfactant-loaded glyphosate product, and Vastland. Vastland is the new triclopyr amine formulation. It does not carry the danger warning, so it does not have the eye or skin irritation like the old Garlon 3A has. And you're going to apply them at 3 quarts to 1.5 quarts per acre. So that 2-to-1 ratio, 3 quarts of glyphosate, 1.5 quarts triclopyr per acre. So if you don't know how to do spot treatments and calibrate for spot treatments to get those per acre rates, I have a fact sheet that I'd be happy to share with you to show you how to do that. And then basal bark treatments and stump treatments, they can be done year-round, particularly using the triclopyr ester formulation like Garland 4 Ultra, or maybe the ready-to-use product called Pathfinder 2 is also very effective. I like to target my basal bark applications in this early season window, and I specifically schedule days to be in the woods applying basal bark applications very early season when these shrubs are leafing out and none of the native plants are, and I don't have any herbaceous vegetation up even at that time. I can be very selective with basal bark treatments at that time of year, and it's super effective on things like barberry, rose, olive, and even small honeysuckle are very easily controlled with basal bark applications. The last one that we'll talk about here is Tree of Heaven, and then we'll wrap things up and open it up for questions. So Tree of Heaven can grow into a very large tree, 80 feet tall, 3-4 feet in diameter is not uncommon for a lot of these large Tree of Heaven that have been around for a long time. I mean, it was first introduced in the late 1700s into the Philadelphia area. So that stout, blunt twig that you see here with these large V-shaped leaf scars, very characteristic. Pinnately compound leaves, so it has this central stem. This is one leaf, and these are leaflets along that central stem called the rachis. So a pinnately compound leaf, they can be as long as 4 feet. Here's the papery seeds. This tree also has separate male and female trees. So the female are going to be the seed producers. And then again, that strong offensive odor. So if you were to crush the foliage or break these twigs, you'd smell what some people describe as burnt peanut butter. So just a real nasty odor, something that you'll recognize once you smell it. So the female trees can produce over 300,000 seeds annually, but it's also a root suckering tree, and it can send up root suckers up to 50 feet away from the parent tree. So like you see in this image, here's the parent tree, and all of these are root suckers on the same root system as that parent tree. And again, this is an allelopathic plant, so it produces a toxin that prevents other plants from growing. So mechanical means are not effective at controlling this plant. So you see in this image right here, these were cut the previous growing season, and this is 1 year of regrowth following just simply cutting and not applying any kind of herbicide treatments. Cultural control, you got to be careful moving contaminated soil that again might have root fragments or even contain seed, and learn to recognize what those young seedlings look like. Again, we do have the biological control that hopefully someday will be available to control this tree, but right now we do not have that available for us to introduce into different infestations. So that lands us here on chemical control. Again, because this is a root suckering tree, all of our treatments are late season, no earlier than July 1, right on through September or to the onset of fall coloration. And we're typically going to look at 3 different types of application methods: foliar applications, hack and squirt applications using spaced cuts. It's very important that you do not girdle that stem. You need to have spaces between your cuts to allow translocation to the root system, because the key to controlling this plant is controlling the roots. And then lastly, basal bark like you see here. We do not recommend to do stump treatments on this plant. What will happen with stump treatments typically, you will control that stump and you'll prevent that stump from resprouting, but you will not allow for herbicide movement down to the root systems, and it's likely that it's going to resprout on you. If the tree has to be removed, kill it first using one of these methods here, foliar hack and squirt of basil bark, wait 30 days, and then remove the tree. So there's the treatment calendar. Notice that all of our treatments start July 1. So foliar, basil bark, and hack and squirt. This is a site where the stems were treated in early spring. You can see we killed very successfully all of the upper stems, but we did not control the root system. And you see all the resprouting that has occurred from the root system here by applying products too late, where we did not get movement down, or I'm sorry, we applied products too early, where we did not get movement down to the root system. We just simply killed the top of the tree. So in summary, learn to identify invasive plants by scouting your properties often. Implement control measures immediately. You can pull small infestations in plants. Herbicides are going to be your most productive approach, though. Start in least invaded areas first and move towards real problem areas, but keep those good areas good. Keep those least invaded areas from being covered up. Those are really effective places to start your treatments. And then follow up on all applications. And it's really necessary on a lot of these plants, particularly in year 2, and then move into an annual maintenance program. So with that, we can open it up for questions, and I'll just mention a couple of resources that Pete's going to send out some links to you for these things. But this is a little pocket booklet that we created a couple of years ago that's for sale on our website. And then the wildland weed management site at Penn State is going to be your go-to resource for a lot of our invasive plant quick sheets that give you summaries of all these control recommendations that I went over here tonight. So with that, Pete, I think we're good for questions if people have any.
Super. Dave, thank you. So I'm chuckling because I'm remembering your comments about the identification of Tree of Heaven. And I remember when I was a graduate student and I was teaching tree identification, which is dendrology. And I like to take when there were plants that had kind of dramatic sensory related identification cues like smell or some might taste or something. And so it always, before I would give the name of the plant or what it was I wanted them to focus on, I would say, okay, now, and so I had them at this Tree of Heaven. And I said, all right, now everybody take some leaflets and crush the leaflets and tell me what you smell. And, and so people were going around and they were offering these analogies of really bad smelling things. And I won't repeat any of those words here, but these are things that, and then there's this one student that said, oh, this smells like lasagna.
Oh my.
And all I could think of was, that's not any place I would want to go to eat lasagna, because it's not going to be pleasant.
Yeah, who's making your lasagna? That's not good. I don't think I'd ever use that description. Pete.
No. That's it stuck out with me as like, beauty is in the eye of the beholder, and we all have these like different perceptions of what reality is. So.
Well, and I've never smelled burnt peanut butter for that matter. So.
Yeah, and I think they're being generous if they call it. I'm trying to picture burnt. I think I would enjoy burnt peanut butter.
Maybe so, right?
Right. So I guess it depends on how badly it's burnt. So if any of you have questions, this is a great time to offer those. We do have one question that we'll get to. And Dave has some references that he's already emailed me. I'm going to be sending an email to everybody who registered for the webinar. We had well over 200 people register. There were over 200 participants. So this was a really nice turnout for an exceptional webinar presentation. So let's start with, we have a question from Joan, wants to know if sulfometron methyl is approved for use in wetland areas.
It does not have a wetland label. So I would say no to that.
So does that mean it cannot be used in a wetland, or you just have to use extra I mean, so
Right, so it comes
do you
back
need,
to labeled sites. And so
okay.
labeled sites would not permit it to be in a wetland.
So it would be, so what defines the wetland? And I'm not trying to find a loophole here, but is it,
Yeah.
is it a matter of saying, would a reasonable person look at this and say, okay, this is a wetland, or do you need to have a wetland delineator come in? Do you know how that's the
Yeah, I
details of that?
don't, Pete. I really am not sure how, forested wetlands, can probably be common on some sites, but this is not a product that is labeled for wetland applications.
So in areas that are clearly wetlands, you would clearly want to avoid applications here.
Yeah, in fact, I just opened the label. It says for terrestrial uses, except except for uses under the forest canopy, do not apply directly to water or in areas where surface water is present or to intertidal areas below the main high water mark. Do not contaminate water by disposing of equipment, wash water, or rinsate. So, yeah, I don't think that we can do anything with wetland areas with this product.
But it's, so these are, it's out, at least for the label in Pennsylvania, and it certainly depends upon, it looks like Jones in Massachusetts. Um, it looks like the concern is about open water or exposed water or seasonally flooded areas.
Yeah, it does. You're right.
So,
Yeah.
so you might have an area that could be defined as a wetland by a delineator, but if it's in the dry season, then it might be okay. Probably the best bet is to check with your state pesticide agency so that you don't get crosswise with them.
Yeah, I'm trying to find all the listed sites in here. Boy, some of these labels just aren't easy to use.
Right. Yeah, they split up the information into different locations.
Yeah, exactly.
So
Okay.
the label's the law. So always read the label pertinent to your state.
Yeah.
So Dale says, where do you get the pamphlets? So Dale, I'll be sending out an email that has that information.
So Penn State Extension, if you Google that, invasive forest plants and Penn State Extension's website, even if you just use Google, you'd probably land on it. It's for sale. So I believe they're $10 each plus shipping.
Okay. And as I think I forgot to mention earlier, for those of you that are interested in continuing education credits, I have what I need from you. When you registered for the webinar, you responded to some mandatory questions about continuing ed. And for those of you that want continuing ed, you'll be receiving, it'll probably be early to mid next week because I'm going to be traveling for the next few days. But I'll send out a blanket email that provides documentation for that. And this webinar and the noon webinar was recorded, though one version, probably the noon version, will be uploaded to the YouTube Forest Connect site. So if you go to youtube.com/forestconnect, you can see this webinar and webinars from the last 12 years. So we upload all of those.
Pete, I found some information here.
Oh, good.
So let's go back to that first question about wetlands. So actually we do have a label that does allow that to happen. So in fact, it's pretty liberal. I have not really noticed this before. So this product may be applied in forestry. And so it did have a forestry exemption. So this product may be applied on forestry non-agricultural sites that contain areas of temporary surface water caused by collection of water between planting beds, in equipment ruts, or other depressions created by management activities. It is permissible to treat intermittently flooded low-lying sites, seasonal dry floodplains, and transitional areas between upland and lowland sites when no water is present. It is also permissible to treat marshes, swamps, and bogs when water has receded, as well as seasonally dry flood deltas. So you were correct in your assumption there.
Wow. that gives a lot of latitude for uses.
Yeah, and then it specifically says, do not make applications to natural or man-made bodies of water such as lakes, reservoirs, ponds, streams, and canals. So it doesn't have aquatic labeling where you can apply it to water per se, but it does have a wetland labeling, certainly.
Mm-hmm. And I would add to that I know that New York, so the pesticide companies develop sometimes state-specific labels. So the New York label is oftentimes different than the Pennsylvania label, and it's worth even Dave's. I'm assuming reading the Pennsylvania label, so I'm just saying make sure that the label that is legal in your state has that same description before you go out and start spraying into things that might get you into a jam.
Yeah, exactly. And honestly, I think Pennsylvania, as my understanding, our Department of Agriculture accepts the manufacturer's label, and I believe New York adds some restrictions to that.
If they can add a restriction, they will. So, and Carl has posted a link to the invasive forest plants of the Mid-Atlantic, so that's in the chat window if people are interested. Well, Dave, I'm not seeing any other questions, so I want to thank you for a fabulous webinar, and I want to thank the audience for being present. This is way more fun when we have people listening to us, and we appreciate you taking the time this evening to join us. So thank you all. August is our off month for webinars. We always have poor attendance in August, so I just take that month off, and we'll be coming back together in September, the third Wednesday, talking about legacy planning. So transitioning of forest land from one owner to the next owner. So thank you, Dave. Thank you all. Hope you have
Okay. Yep. Thanks, Pete. And we'll catch up with you some other time. Thanks, folks.
Indeed. Thanks, everyone.